My name's Adele Jones. I'm Deputy Chief Executive of the Sustainable Food Trust, and I'm really delighted to be here today with a fantastic lineup of speakers who I'll introduce in a moment. But just to say a little bit about today's theme, we are, as you know, going to be talking about measuring on-farm biodiversity, which is a really hot topic, you could say, at the moment. It's something that a lot of people are trying to get their head around. Particularly as we're entering into this new phase of thinking about how we can reward farmers for things that they're not currently rewarded for. So, say public goods, as we're now referring to them as. Biodiversity is one of those incredibly important things that many farmers are really working to deliver and have thrive on their farms and across landscapes. And actually, that's not something that they've been paid for financially, which is one of the reasons why sustainable farming and sustainable food production has not as yet become the mainstream business model for how we produce our food, because these things that farmers are delivering, these public goods, are not rewarded in the marketplace or through public money. But that's hopefully all changing. Farmers will, going forward, be paid to deliver public goods, including biodiversity, including storing carbon, water quality, air quality, high animal welfare, these things that in some regard have not been rewarded to date. But in order to do that, we need to understand A, where we're starting from, and B, the progress we're making over time, which is why measuring sustainability has become one of the Sustainable Food Trust's priority areas of work. And we are delivering that through a project that we're now calling the Global Farm Metric, which I think many of you are aware of. We hosted a TEDx event back at the end of April to launch the Global Farm Metric project with His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales, Minette Butters, Henry Dimbleby, and David Potts from Morrison's. And we're taking the Global Farm Metric project forward as part of a dynamic and growing coalition of organisations made up of farmers, food companies, farming unions, NGOs, supermarkets, and government officials as well. And within the Global Farm Metric, I might just share my screen actually, so you can see what I'm talking about here, because that always helps. There we are. Hopefully you can all see that. But within the Global Farm Metric, which takes a holistic whole farm approach, and it covers what some people refer to as the 3 Ps, people, profit, and planet. It has 11 categories of assessment which span the whole farm. So these 11 categories are, as you can see here, it's displayed around the outside of this wheel. And within those 11 categories, we've identified 3 key indicators which sit under each. And of course, there's more detail beneath that. So we have the categories, the key indicators, but we're also working to try and identify the individual metrics which feed into these indicators. So there's more detail below this wheel, but this should give you a really good understanding of where we are. And this Global Farm Metric framework has been designed almost entirely by farmers over the last 5 years. We set up a farmers and land managers working group back in 2016, who have been working to look at all the audits that they currently do on their farm, look at the different ways that they're currently measuring change and reporting to whether it's government or their certification scheme or the supermarkets or even their bank managers in some cases, and really trying to understand what's the best bits of those. And some of the categories are a little bit easier, you could say, to try and pin down what the metrics and indicators should be. For example, energy and resource use. We've got quite a good understanding of the type of things we need to be measuring and reporting on to do better in that category. Biodiversity is one of those where I think there's still a lot to discuss. And there's some really fantastic initiatives going on all over the world to really try and nail down what we should be measuring and reporting on when it comes to biodiversity. You might be able to see, from the wheel here that our biodiversity category has 3 key indicators. Natural or wild biodiversity, you could say. So, what's the biodiversity that exists naturally on your farm or within a landscape? Birds, bees, insects, mammals. Agricultural biodiversity, which is sometimes one that is often missed out of the conversation. So effectively your seeds and breeds. Are you maintaining genetic diversity, rare breeds, heritage, varieties of crops and livestock? So we think that's a really important part of biodiversity. And then finally, landscape. So, you know, what are you doing to connect up the habitats that you're managing? Are you taking part in landscape level flood restoration projects? And also heritage. So, you know, are there any ancient monuments on your land that you are looking after and maintaining that part of the farm and landscape going forward? But today we're going to be focused on the natural or wild biodiversity, and really having an in-depth conversation, hopefully, about the different methodologies that are starting to emerge, which are looking at how we measure that biodiversity on farm. And I'm particularly interested because I think a lot of the conversations about measuring biodiversity to date have been based on practices as proxy for being good things for biodiversity. And by that, I mean, let's say you plant a species mix ley or use cover crops. Evidence will show that that is likely to improve your biodiversity on your farm. And that's so far how we've been monitoring and rewarding farmers for doing those things and improving their biodiversity. But I think now there's some more, you know, financial mechanisms starting to come in, and also the fact that farmers really want to be part of this, you know, part of this biodiversity and climate change solution. I think we need some hard numbers now as to, you know, what can farmers do and how can they progress? How can we measure? Should it be key indicator species? For example, if you have a skylark, then you know you have all these other things further down the species pyramid. Should it be quadrat analysis? Are there some really interesting pieces of technology which use AI, which can identify plants or animal species within a particular area? I know there's bat monitoring devices as well. So there's so many ideas out there, and what we're trying to do is work as part of a coalition with as many organizations and experts as possible to co-design this framework. And so I hope today's discussion will contribute to that. We're also really interested to hear your views and your questions. So if you have questions, please write them in the chat function, or I don't know, have we got a Q&A box? Sorry, let me unshare my screen so I can see if we've got a Q&A box as well. No, we don't. So just write them in the chat if that's okay as we go along, and then we will get to the discussion as soon as possible, because I think that's going to be a really interesting part of this webinar. So I'm going to hand over to Patrick, because he is now not in the car, to introduce our speakers and say a little bit more about why he's so passionate about this topic as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adele, for giving that very comprehensive introduction. Welcome to everyone. I don't know how many people we've got actually have joined us, but over 400 people registered, which is an amazing number. And I'm so delighted that we've got 3 speakers, but I'm also delighted that we've got so many other people participating, many of whom have considerably more expertise in this theme than I do, although I hope that what I make up for in lack of knowledge is expressed in passion and enthusiasm I have for the biodiversity of the natural world, which goes right back to my childhood, when I used to dig ponds in my London gardens and fell in love with nature really because of biodiversity. And throughout my farming life, which now spans nearly 50 years, I've really been more interested than anything about how much nature could coexist with the farming system that I'm managing. And I've got lots of anecdotal observations, and I continue to be convinced that it is possible to farm in harmony with nature and to have fantastic biodiversity outcomes. But what I really want to know is how I can improve year on year in that. And in order to do that, I need to be able to measure the biodiversity impacts of my farming system. And before I introduce the speakers, I just want to say that I, as Adele said, I've just returned literally from Cloisters in Switzerland. And yesterday I was at 2,000 meters up in the high alpage with an amazing woman called Gudrun, who took us on a tour of the biodiversity of the pastures, which were being grazed by the dairy cows that have just gone up to their summer pastures. And she just spotted all these incredible wildflowers, which are part of the pastures being grazed by these cattle, and talked about their nutritional and medicinal qualities. And she said at the end of this tour that she was worried that even there in, you know, the Alps of Switzerland, the growing numbers of the dairy herds brought about by economic pressures are threatening the biodiversity of the high alpage. And I thought, wow, even up here, the issue that's confronting the whole of agriculture, no fault of the farmers, is revealing itself in farmers over-fertilizing their land, either with nitrogen or with manure, or a combination of the two. So this is a really pressing issue. And during this conference, which was on the theme of food systems and biodiversity, I met a couple of people, John Hutton, who's the conservation director of WWF International, and another chap called Tony Simons, who runs a huge agriculture organization based in Nairobi. And we had a lunchtime conversation yesterday about how we could measure on-farm biodiversity. And both Tony and John said, you've got to, first of all, frame it by recognizing that every little tiny piece of the planet has a capacity, if you like, in a sort of natural ecosystem to express itself through biodiversity. But that will be different in different parts of the world, obviously, but also even different parts of farms. And Gudrun was pointing out that, you know, there's part of the Alps, which is Africa, and another part, which is limestone. And in each of those rock bases, there will be different biodiversity. So the question arose, on the one hand, we need to have a, as it were, what we could reach if we were the perfect expression of farming in harmony with nature on our particular farm. But on the other hand, and that's the sort of top-down approach, which maybe you could do from satellites and stuff like that. Or there's the bottom-up approach, which our farmers and managers working group have been working on a lot, which is the question, which hopefully we can explore during this session, which is, what are the key indicator species? Because farmers haven't got all the time in the world on their hands, which if those species were present, we could be fairly sure, really sure, in a sort of scientific way, that the biodiversity of the farm was scoring well. And are those species at the bottom of the food chain or at the top? And there seem to be two camps on that one. You know, a lot of people are saying, well, if you have a key predator or whatever, then everything below it's going to be good. And then I think it was Tony was saying yesterday, trees are important. If certain trees are there, then that means that a lot of other stuff's going to be there. Or another man who may be on this call, John Westlake, who heads up the policy team of the Welsh government, said, you know, maybe it's the plant communities in a quadrat, because if they are there, then the pollinators can be there and all the rest of it. And I'm sure there's not one answer to this, but what we have here is an amazing collection of people on the webinar itself, but also who are about to speak to us and share their thoughts about how we can create what Adele has already mentioned, is a global coalition to make sure that we really can accurately measure the response of the global farming community to reversing the catastrophic decline which has taken place in biodiversity during my farming lifetime through our collective efforts. But we can't manage this process without measuring our impacts. And that is the really big challenge we face today. So I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Ian Dunn, who's Chief Executive of Plant Life. And you were previously with the British Antarctic Survey, were you not, Ian?
Yes,
and
that's correct.
And in a previous conversation, you generously said, you not only mentioned citizen science, but you also generously said, look, you know, you do have expertise, and many of the other conservation organizations have expertise. So maybe you can in some way help to host the emergence of an informal coalition of NGOs and others that could help this very, very important task that they're facing. So over to you, Ian, and thank you very, very much for joining us at relatively short notice.
Great. Well, thank you, Patrick, and also Adele, and to the Sustainable Food Trust for pulling this discussion together. I have got the delight of going first, and that gives me an opportunity perhaps to also set the framework a little bit. And I was asked to look at 4 questions, as well as Patrick's introduction, around how do we measure biodiversity on farms? What are some of the indicator species? what would I do to think about changing some of the farming systems, if there was one thing, for the benefit of biodiversity? And lastly, what did I think about land sharing versus land sparing? So I'm going to touch on each of those four, but I'm also recognizing it's a Friday afternoon. We've all had really busy weeks. So I'm going to interweave a few other themes as well. And I am going to keep it to my 10 minutes. So I'm going to start off with a quote from Albert Einstein, who said, look deep into nature, and then you will understand everything better. And the relevance of this, of course, is because I think we can be taught a huge amount by nature. And I'm going to bring that into the biodiversity context. And initially, I'm just going to start off by saying that some of the outcomes that, for example, came out of Aichi in 2013, where we had over or nearly 100 different indicators of biodiversity, effectively means you don't have any indicators. If you have such a plethora, such a vast range of ways of looking at a topic, it's really very, very difficult to arrive at what Patrick is talking about, which is a global metric. Now, within that, there's been lots of, since that, there's been an awful lot of work undertaken to see how we can perhaps look at different options. And I put on the table now that I am not a great fan of proxies. Proxies, I think, by and large, are a way of avoiding getting to the outcomes that we aspire to. But there were 6 main areas where perhaps you can start to look at biodiversity in the farming community and the importance of this. And I'm going to use the UK as a reference point. 70% of our land in the UK is used for agriculture. The gross value add of agriculture in the UK is somewhere between 5 to 8 billion pounds per year. It was slightly lower last year. The subsidies under the present structure, and Adele referenced some of the changes, but the present subsidies are running at around about 2.5 to 3 billion per year. And I'm going to come on to nitrogen later as one of the big impactors of biodiversity. We know that the negative impact of nitrogen pollution is somewhere in the region of 2 to 3 billion pounds a year, as much as you can ever truly estimate it. So from an economic point of view, our present system isn't working. From a biodiversity point of view, and again, Patrick referenced the parlous state of nature. If you look at the state of nature reports, the UK is one of the most impoverished nations in terms of the state of biodiversity. So we have a situation where 70% of our land is used in agriculture, extraordinarily poor biodiversity state of nature, and economics that don't work. So how do we start tackling this conundrum alongside looking at food security and so on and so forth? Well, let's first of all look at measuring biodiversity. So you can do that in 6 larger ways, perhaps, if I refer them in that form. You can look at an ecosystem structure, which looks at the structural complexity and the fragmentation of a habitat. You can look at the function of an ecosystem. So what is its productivity and the carbon cycle, for example. You can look at the composition. You can look at the community composition, whether that's species per unit or species richness. There's a number of different ways. The species populations, so what's the abundance and what's the distribution like? The traits of the species. We're seeing lots of changes in body size, in plant height, in clutch sizes, etc. And number 6, you can look at genetic composition and diversity within the gene pool. That's really complex stuff, and it's really difficult to get your head around in terms of how you bring that onto the ground. But these are known as EBVs, or essential biodiversity variables. Now, recognizing that complexity, you can then move to the next stage and say, well, okay, how do we then narrow it down perhaps further? Lots of discussions around, do you use the IUCN Red List Index, so this sense of indicator species, looking at the rarest ones. You can look at the Living Planet Index, or you can look at a Biodiversity Intactness Index, all of which would look at biotic integrity, would look at the health of a population or a habitat at any particular time. So in terms of how you can measure biodiversity on farms, there have been, and there continue to be, many efforts by many really intelligent and really smart people looking at how to do this, and none of it is really landing. And I'm going to suggest to you that part of the reason why it isn't landing, it isn't working, is because we're not yet bringing in the social factors. We're not bringing in the art, the poetry, the creativity, the well-being impact. That if we could bring that into our understanding of biodiversity, we would start to fundamentally change how we would be looking at biodiversity. And as the Dasgupta review suggests, how we would be valuing biodiversity. So the objective that we are seeking is absolutely right, is absolutely necessary, but I think it also needs to be considered in a wider sense. Can I just check, Adele, that you're hearing me clearly?
Yeah, all okay. All good.
Yeah, I think that must be the particular person's audio, because I'm hearing you very well.
Thank you. Now I'm going to move on to very quickly looking at some of the indicators from a UK perspective. But before I do that, I'm actually going to go to quote number 2 this afternoon, which actually is from Jane Goodall. And I did some work with Jane Goodall historically. And she said that someday we shall look back on this dark era of agriculture and shake our heads. How could we have ever believed that it was a good idea to grow our food with poisons? Now, that's a very extreme statement. I referenced the fact that it's a Friday afternoon. I'm going to be a little bit challenging, but the challenge is correct. And I'm particularly going to go on to, before I sort of cover some of the indicator species, I'm just going to talk a little bit about nitrogen. Nitrogen is one of the most significant polluters we have in our farming systems. We waste approximately 40% of all the nitrogen that goes onto our land. We have waterborne nitrogen, which leads to hypoxic waterways, but we also have, which is perhaps less known, a very significant amount of airborne pollution from nitrogen. The consequence of airborne pollution from nitrogen is that you effectively layer nutrients onto the soils. And again, I know we have an international audience, but particularly from a UK perspective, our native soils are nutrient poor. And if you add nitrogen to them, you actually nutrient enrich them, you make them more acidic. And as a consequence, you start to lose some of the indicator species. So what would we be looking for? We would be looking for pasque flower, we would be looking for round-headed rampion, early gentian, Spanish catchfly, but you'd also be looking for lapwing, for kestrels, for the skylarks. And from a pollinator's point of view, and as plant life, we do a lot of work with the Butterfly Trust and the Bumblebee Conservation Trust. You'd be looking at the longhorn bee, the shrill carder bee, and for example, the small copper butterfly. So we can use indicator species as a proxy for the health of a habitat, but I would challenge us again to perhaps think that that might be just a little bit too easy for what we're trying to achieve. So nitrogen is part of the reason why that doesn't happen. We have ineffective regulation. It's very much absent and it's largely unenforced. And the only, from a UK perspective, the only one of our devolved nations that I would say is really beginning to grapple successfully at the moment is the Scottish government, some activity in Wales as well. But I would suggest and I would challenge the UK overall to start to look at a nitrogen budget as well as a carbon budget. And that would be one of the changes I would make, because I think would have a very tangible benefit with the dog barking in the background.
Could somebody mute their dog?
We would have a very immediate change in the quality of our agricultural land if we were fundamentally to change the nitrogen placed upon it. I was asked to mention a little bit, just talk about land sharing versus land sparing. I've just got a minute or left. So I find that discussion too binary and it's a little bit too simplistic. I immensely dislike the term land sparing because it suggests that we would only ever use land that would be spared from human usage. And I think philosophically, that is just a completely inaccurate starting point to begin with. However, I do think there are parts of our land mass which need to be completely separated from our agricultural activity, because there are some of our habitats and some of our communities that can only thrive if they are not impacted heavily by humans. But if you've got 70% of your land used for agriculture for all the reasons we know, land sharing has to be the way forward. That has to be the structural way forward. And we have to find a way to truly embrace living with wildlife in mind on our farming systems, with the consequences that has. So, and that's a very different system. It's moving away from the post-war change in agriculture in the UK, where we rapidly intensified and we covered our land in chemicals and nutrients. And that's a change in how we appreciate food. It's going to be a change in how we spend our money on food, how much of our money on food we spend, and how we start to perhaps change some of our eating habits as well as some of our farming habits. And I'm going to finish with my perhaps third quote, and I'm going to go back to Albert Einstein again, and I'm going to ask us to apply this to the challenge that Patrick has set us. And he said, and remember this was about 1920 or so, I haven't got the exact date of when he said this, but he said, our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion to embrace the whole of nature in all of its beauty. And I think that is the challenge that faces us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Ian. I thought that was a wonderful opening presentation and extremely stimulating. May I just ask you a couple of follow-up questions before we move on to our next speaker? You started by saying you didn't like proxies, and then you did identify some potential candidates for proxies if we have to go down the proxy route. So my question to you is this: I'm a farmer. I would be quite happy to involve citizen science and an army of researchers, as long as I didn't have to pay for all the time, in helping me to identify the right species on my farm, which would be reasonable biodiversity indicators, given that we can't measure everything. But let's say I am the Welsh government, or maybe a food company that wants to either enable their customers to pay more for biodiversity friendly food, or reward farmers for increasing their farmland biodiversity. What species would they be top or bottom of the food chain, which do you think would be the best indicators if you only had to choose a few? And secondly, what is your comment to my opening remark about the need to establish the top capacity of a landscape to have a biodiverse, rich environment, taking your point that you can't have a one size fits all? So you've got to deal with the local and the regional as well as the global. So two questions there.
Okay, well, of course, recalling that I work for Plant Life International, maybe I would say that I would be very, very focused initially on some of the smaller parts of the system rather than the top predators, Patrick. But in fact, I would actually go far beyond plants. I think what's fundamental, and it actually leads through to answering your second question, if you understand, and I'm going to go right back to Darwin here in terms of some of his theories, if you understand your geology, you will understand your soils. If you understand your soils and your geology, you'll understand your plant communities, and then you can look at the loading capability in that particular space, in that area. So I would actually say increasingly, we know that the fungal communities within pastures, for example, are critically important. And if you think about how the myceli of fungi work when they're exploring underneath the soils, fungi have a carbon tip on the end of their mycelium. And as they go in and they come out, they leave the carbon behind. So we now believe that species-rich grasslands have the same carbon capture capability as woodlands. Now that's an amazing finding, which is not yet being communicated, is not yet understood. So that starts to tell you that, in fact, you can look at a pasture and you can say you can achieve a climate response as well as a biodiversity response. So I would go right back to say, if we can get the foundations of our habitats as healthy as we can, much of the rest of it will follow.
So are you saying, therefore, that it's as much about practice and inputs as it is about the outcomes in terms of biodiversity? Now, let me press you again. Which species?
Well, I'm deliberately going to duck the species question because I think it depends where you are and what you're looking at doing. I think I'm going to just come back to proxies, and so very happy to be pressed on those couple of points. Proxies, I think, require really good intent to exist. if you have good intent amongst the actors, the human actors within the structure, proxies work. If you do not have good intent, and we know we have both, proxies don't work. Now, I think we can definitely, with all the knowledge we have in many parts of the world, not everywhere, of course, but with all the knowledge we have around local habitats and all the recording we have of it, I think we probably can actually identify key indicator species for quite local areas. And that's what I would encourage us to do, because that's what engages people. People love to see the skylark. I was up in Muki Meadows last week, and the curlews, the call of the curlew is just the most evocative call. It's just amazing to hear it. And to get the curlews, you need to have the right kind of habitats. So I think we can get indicator species, but it requires really good intent, Patrick, of people if we're going to use proxies.
So you're now, let's say you're the Welsh Government, and as I mentioned, John Westlake, who heads up the agricultural policy team, may be on this webinar. He has the challenge of introducing a scheme to support regenerative sustainable farming, choose your term, and he's minded to adopt to require the participant farmers in the new scheme to undertake an annual sustainability audit, part of which will be a biodiversity assessment. Can you help him? And are you willing to continue to help him after this webinar? Because I think that is what is needed.
Yeah, well, I think given the time we have and the other speakers, I'm absolutely willing to work with anybody looking at enhancing that. Our objective within Plant Life is to support improved plant diversity, plant biodiversity, and healthy plant communities, because by doing that, all the rest will follow. So it's a categoric yes, Patrick, we will work with anybody who shares that objective.
Okay, well, thank you. I don't know if other people are doing this, but I'm just glancing at who's on this. And we've got the most, star-studded and influential range of experts from, individual citizens to people who are involved with organizations on this, listening to this. And thank you so much for joining. So Ian has laid down an invitation, which we would echo to everyone to get involved with co-evolving the right way of measuring biodiversity in a realistic way, on-farm biodiversity in a realistic way. And by the way, just a little plug on your nitrogen point, Ian. Wales is going to become a nitrate vulnerable zone. You probably know that. And I guess that is going to have the effect of reducing the nitrogen intensity use on farmland, which probably will contribute towards our shared goals. But now I'm going to move on and introduce our second speaker, Marian Hamel. I hope I pronounced your name, Marian, right. I haven't met you until now, and only virtually, but I know because I heard in Cloisters that you are one of the world's leading experts on linking farm biodiversity to food systems, and you've got a number of roles. You're the managing director of the Lake Constance Foundation. You're the honorary president of the Global Nature Fund, but you've also been involved with this EU Life project, which is developing standards for biodiversity and linking them to labels. So we would love to hear from you and maybe a response to Ian, but also how you could potentially get involved with this global challenge. Marian.
Okay, thank you. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. There is one micro still open. I think I listen an echo. And I think I will present shortly our approach, which is very different from what I'm listening up to now. This is a consortium of environmental organizations from Germany, from Spain, from France, and from Portugal. We are working in this project on biodiversity in standards and labels for the food sector. As you surely know, there are many standards, certifications for the food sector. Only for the European market, we counted about 400. And these are standards certifying a certain quality of a product or of a production way. And we made an analysis of more than 50 standards, and we learned that biodiversity was not very well addressed in the standards. And then we started together with the standards to look at the aspects which are relevant for biodiversity, and how should criteria look like to improve biodiversity performance and to lead to an effective protection of biodiversity. And what we did also is we developed two tools. One of them is the biodiversity performance tool, which is a tool which helps farmers to do a baseline on the farm in regard to biodiversity, and to develop a biodiversity action plan, because we are very much convinced that biodiversity needs continuous management, also the improvement of biodiversity. And this is one tool, the biodiversity performance tool. And then we developed also a biodiversity monitoring system, which is for standards and food companies and also big suppliers which are managing a lot of farms, in order to have more insights about the biodiversity performance on their member farms, on the certified farms, etc. When it comes to measuring biodiversity, we discussed really a lot with the standards and also with farmers and food companies about what to measure and how, and who will cover the costs, because in the end you can measure everything if you have a budget for this. And we agreed on two lines. One of them is biodiversity management, and biodiversity management is focusing in our biodiversity performance tool and also in our recommendation mainly on habitats, on the protection of natural and semi-natural habitats, on the enhancement of these habitats, on the restoration of habitats, etc. And here we are covering aspects such as the size of the habitat, but also certain quality aspects and fragmentation, or the other way around, how to connect habitats on the farm, and also the management of habitats, if there are buffer zones around to avoid the fertilization and the use of pesticides, etc., etc. This all is covered within biodiversity management, and this is what we title with create potentials for biodiversity, because without habitats, species do not have a habitat and refugium and food sources and so on, and it is difficult to increase species. The other big line is reducing the negative impacts on biodiversity, and here we had a look to what are the main negative impacts, and of course we came to soil, also to the use of fertilizers, to erosion, crop rotation, cover crops, etc., etc. This is a big part of our biodiversity performance tool, but then also pesticide management. And as NGOs, of course, we are defending organic agriculture, but we think also, and this is one of our recommendations, at least to go to an integrated pest management where the use of chemical pesticides is the last option, would be a big step to reduce negative impacts on biodiversity. We have a look on water and relate water to the water sources, because aquatic ecosystems are delivering the water for irrigation and are contaminated by agriculture very often. So we have this, and we are also at a minor extent looking at genetic diversity to preserve and to enhance traditional crops and breeds. So this is the line of reducing negative impacts on biodiversity. And our biodiversity performance tool, which includes 78 key data and indicator concerning biodiversity management and reducing negative impacts, what we are calling very good agricultural practices. The biodiversity performance tool in the end helps the farmer to have a baseline, because this is very important. If you want to measure something, you need to know your starting point, and this is still very often not known and not requested by the standards. And then it makes a very simple evaluation of the strengths and weaknesses of all these elements which I mentioned, very simple in a line of a traffic light. You have red, yellow, no, you have red, orange, yellow, and green. And so the farmer has an indication where he is on a good track and where he should really take measures. And these measures will be included then in the so-called biodiversity action plan. A biodiversity action plan or management is now more often required in standards like Rainforest Alliance, Fair Trade, Demeter, Global Gap will come up with a biodiversity management. So the tool is useful for the farmers to comply with this criteria of standards. And what we are doing now is we are using these tools also. Now we started to use this tool on a landscape level, and therefore I come to your last question. We see, for us it is evident that we need to extend our point of view and the point of view of the standards from the farm level to landscape level, because if you have one farmer which is very engaged, etc., but he is in a desert of farmers which are not engaged, he cannot improve a lot. So we created insect responsible sourcing regions, because now, because of the dramatic loss of insects in Germany and in Europe, there is a special attention on this. And here we will apply the tools, the biodiversity performance tool, as well as the monitoring system, which aggregates data and can then deliver data for a region of our country. We will extend this to sourcing regions. And not to forget that besides key indicator species or whatever you will use for measuring, our standards, which we discussed a lot with, they are willing to do everything, but it is the question of who will pay for it. And of course, they refrain that the costs for measuring and the cost for monitoring should be only covered by the farmers, and especially when it is on an international level and standards are dealing with smallholder farmers, etc., then this who will pay for the costs is a really crucial question. And also this is one thing. And the other, when you are working on an international level, which the speaker before also mentioned, you need to come also to internationally valid criteria or procedures, and therefore we think the habitats are a good way. And to explain and to agree on procedures, how to do a biodiversity action plan, etc., because the procedures can be applied everywhere, and this are good ways to go forward. And at least the standards which we are dealing with, which are around now 30 standards, and some companies, you know, that companies very often have their own sourcing guidelines, etc. They are going now with us in this direction. So
well,
thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. You covered so much ground there, Marion, and a lot of questions I want to ask, but I think I just would focus on one or two. Just at the end, you implied that we need to collaborate towards reaching some key decisions together as an international community. Would you be willing to help with that process? I know you're already involved very much, and you described all the initiatives that you're involved with. Would you be prepared to help us in our initiative, particularly to harmonize the way which farmers can measure their biodiversity from the farm up? Was that something you'd be willing to help with?
Yes, if I can, yes. As I tried to explain, we are not coming from the scientific point of view. Of course, our organizations are involved in big EU research projects like or were involved, like Bio, etc. But we tried to find a way which is internationally applicable and also would have an acceptable relation between output and costs. And
yes.
This I can.
You brought up the cost question several times, which is very important. Yeah. The other point I wanted to raise, maybe a little bit provocative, is that I just got the slight impression that you're more of a land. I know that Dean didn't like the binary nature of the land sharing versus land sparing, and I think that's absolutely right, Ian. But I got the impression that when you were talking about your biodiversity action plans and your focus on habitat, there was a kind of presumption that the mainstream farming practices which are out there throughout the world through no fault of the farmers, which have really played their part in destroying the biodiversity which could coexist with farming. There's a sort of feeling that maybe you accept that that's going to have to continue. And I think I'm picking up from the chat that quite a lot of us feel that actually the farm cropped areas themselves, or the pastures, are the key biodiversity habitat. So are you a land sparer or a land sharer? And am I being unfair in what I've suggested to you?
So I strongly, our experience is, first of all, of course, there need to be so-called no-go areas only reserved for nature. But we have this, unfortunately, in Europe, we have only relatively small areas reserved for nature. And therefore, we need also to bring back biodiversity on the land used. And as Ian told, the land is mainly used for agriculture. So we need to have a look how to improve biodiversity on agricultural land, but also not forget other land uses like urbanizations and so on and so on. No? And what I really where I really see the need to have this in a much better coordinated way, because here we are looking at agricultural farm. There are other initiatives which are looking at biodiversity in urban landscapes, etc., etc. And therefore, for us, it is so important now to look at this landscape approach and to look really at the region and to look how to bring the different land users together to a common approach to improve biodiversity on landscape level.
Well, thank you very much indeed for everything you've shared, and I hope you can stay with us because we're hoping to get some exchange in the questions and discussion afterwards. So now I'm going to turn to our third speaker, John Meadly. John, I'm going to be a bit brutal with you and ask you to stick to 5 minutes, because if you don't, we're going to have no time for the exchange. And I apologize for that in advance, but I will intervene. So what can you share with us in 5 minutes? Because I think it would be fair to describe you as someone whose passion for biodiversity is still playing out in your collaboration with farmers and helping them to celebrate and also measure their biodiversity in the absence as yet of a harmonized framework. So over to you, John.
Okay, am I sharing my screen?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, I thought I got 10 minutes, I only got 5. I'm clearly the small boy here. I'm not a specialist in biodiversity, but I want to share with you just very quickly a 4-year journey working with farmers from the bottom up, which was what you spoke about earlier. And for Ian's point, we do have, I don't know whether you can see this, we do have a poet in residence. So I'm hoping that we've written a book of poetry. So I hope that we can do that. 4 years ago, we looked at, if the soil is alive, how can we monitor its pulse? How can we monitor its blood pressure? And we had a meeting at Fir Farm in the Cotswolds, and we invited 25 plant and soil scientists and 50 farmers together to answer that question. And we asked the scientists to put forward their proxy indicators, and we asked the farmers to vote on it. And it was all a very practical thing. And there's a report there. These slides, hopefully you can access them. You'll find them useful. Out of that emerged the Soil Mentor app. Some of you may know about the Soil Mentor app. And that's this brought together the farmers, and Abby Rose, you can see on the left, that's Rob Matlin of the National Trust, Food and Farming there, looking at how we could create an app that we could record things, the various indicators. So here are just a few of the indicators that we've got, and each of the indicators has a protocol that tells you how to do it and gives you references. And then there's another 20 proxy indicators that you can use to record this. And that app is now being used, as you can see, in 11 countries around the world. We've been working with Dr. Lisa Norton. She's on this call, I know, at the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, and looking at all aspects of the Pasture for Life system, including the biodiversity. And I'm pleased to say that she found that the biodiversity on the Pasture for Life farms was significantly higher than on the control. Then last February, we had a meeting down in Exeter. We brought together a different 50 farmers and about 10 boffins of various kinds and people from FWAG and the Cornwall Wildlife Trust to look again at how we could measure the do an eco check of the farms. And there's a reference there if you want the report. It's full of interesting stuff. What we found is when we began to look at it, there's all these people out there, and there's so many things you can survey. There's the hedgerows, there's the birds, there's the butterflies, there's bug life, there's Ian, there's your organization, Plant Life. There are the Field Studies Council publications. And then if you're going to do this, you need to do it within some kind of habitat classification. And that's already extant there. So, and then we found there were so many people out there, and it's how to make this acceptable to farmers. So if one of this little, here you can see Andy Rummian, he's one of our farmers who's got his binoculars glued to his chest all day. And he suggested that if we are, if you're going to look at birds, there's the 19 farmland bird indicators you could use. If you're looking at plants, you could look at the number of hedgerow species per 100 meters. If you're looking at animals, you could look at the various predators. I'm sorry, I'm short of time, but this was great. This is farmers coming from the bottom up, not boffins coming from the top down. And what's happened here? Oh, yes. So the outcome of this meeting was that we felt it was important that we should be able to generate data on farm, and that we should push forward on this, and that we had these various tools together, like the Public Goods tool and the Soil Mentor app and the Farm Carbon Cutting Toolkit. And then, of course, along came COVID. So the key lessons we've learned from this is biodiversity is very diverse. Obviously, it is the diversity of life, and its nature and extent depends upon all of these factors: ecology, soil type, climate use, etc. So what have we decided to do? Instead of focusing on monitoring, we thought the first thing we're going to do is we're going to focus on celebrating the farms, and then in response to that, we're going to respond to the interest in monitoring. And we've got a group of farmers and academics in the back, scientists in the background to do that. So every fortnight on our farm, on our website, we're going to, there's no time to show you all this, but each fortnight, there will be a farm where they're talking about the biodiversity on their farm, what they're finding, how they're nurturing, how they're measuring it. This is Denise Walton up at Peelham Farm. This is Ian Boyd on the Cotswolds, and the next one is a young a lady farmer coming from down in Devon. We're just celebrating all the biodiversity, and then in response to the reaction to that biodiversity, then we're going to offer to the people who want to monitor on their farms the focus of their interest, the time they've got available, then species knowledge, etc., etc. And to answer your question before you ask me, Patrick, yes, we're very happy to do what we can to help you. I'm sorry, I've only got 5 minutes. So, but the slides are available, and yeah. So this is from the bottom up, working entirely with farmers, with support of a few scientists as well. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much indeed, John, for responding pretty brilliantly to my brutal pairing of your time. In answer to a question on the chat, yes, when you just said so, John, we can share all your slides with everyone. And also I want to say that we're recording the chat, which is unbelievable, and it's just so full and rich and needed for this coalition to co-evolve the right way of assessing farmland biodiversity. And it seems to me what you've just demonstrated is that bottom-up farmer action is an absolutely central part of achieving that. And I would have thought what you're already doing just should be built upon if we're going to get at the right mix of measurements and the right collection of people who are involved with measuring the biodiversity, which of course is and this goes back to Marion's question about who's paying and whether we can have citizen action. There are so many things which come out of it. But do you feel, John, that you could say even now that if you were the architect, the designer of the metrics for measuring farm biodiversity, that you've already identified some key indicators which you would choose?
Well, I think the difficulty for me, I'm not on mute, am I now? For me, I spent all my life working in rural Africa and Asia. So, you know, I tend to look at things from that perspective rather than so if we look at just indicators, things in the UK perspective, which I know is not your intention, but it's complex, you know, and if you go to other parts of the world, the indicator species are quite different. So rather than actually talking, maybe trying to find particular species that have global significance, it's about working out some kind of structure that people can evaluate this. And I found it really fascinating working because you know, we've been working with our 700 members, you know, they're all farmers, nearly all farmers, so a few vets and things. And you've got this huge variation in the amount of time people have got, the focus, what actually they're interested in, above ground, below ground, dung beetles. I mean, at the ground soil event, when they had the dung beetle walk, they were expecting 30 people. They had over 200 people wanted to go and learn about dung beetles and the biodiversity of that. So yeah, I think it's about finding things that are credible, that are.
Do you think there are such things as proxies? I mean, I know Ian's not, you know, that.
No, I think when I mean, you know, I'm getting a bit old now, and I cycle, and I take my blood pressure every 3 months, and if it's a bit high, I cycle a bit faster, and that's an indicator to me of whether I'm, you know, my general fitness. And if my blood pressure is a bit high, then I would start looking around, and you'd have the other indicators of health. So we applied that to the soil specifically, and we got these 25, 30 indicators that you could use, which gives some indication of the life of the soil. And one of the interesting things at Groundswell was they've now got a tool that you can measure the density of fungi and bacteria in the soil. It doesn't tell you the biodiversity, it doesn't tell you the species, but it gives you the density. Well, the fact that all these things, these tools are becoming available, allows you to if you're a farmer, you're going to want to measure the things that are of interest to you. But of course, for your thing, the global thing, well, you want to find some more. Sorry, I don't mean you personally.
Yeah, but I just want to intervene because it's such a delicate thing, this, isn't it? We don't want to homogenize the measurement.
Absolutely.
So that the granularity of the uniqueness of the biodiversity of each farm is kind of obscured by, you know, general trends and things like that. But at the same time, if we have nothing in place, you can't manage or reward so easily what you don't measure. And it seems to me, I'm just speaking personally now, that I think you have to have a cellular element to the measurement, even if there's all this satellite mapping and goodness knows what going on. If we don't empower and inspire the individual farmer to be part of this process, we've lost something crucial. And I just want to make that point, that this whole initiative, this whole global farm metric initiative, came from the work of about 15 or 20 farmers and land managers. So it is a bottom-up initiative. And I've now recently become aware of the importance of the top-down stuff and the points you're making about you can't just measure it for the UK because every place is different. But nevertheless, we've got to work on this.
I'm with you. I'm happy to work with you. It's complex.
Okay, well, that's a great answer. So now the chat's been incredible. Adele, can you steer us to any key questions and frustrated people who are probably on the point of leaving because they feel they haven't been heard? By the way, we will listen to all these points and we will take action from this webinar. We really will do this because I think this is the most difficult of all the categories, the 11 categories that we've been working on to get this right. So I'll ask Ian to come in while you're thinking of which question to ask first, Adele. Ian, do you want to comment on what's just been said, either by Marion or by me or by John?
I think like you, Patrick, immensely rich. And I've been keeping my eye on the chat as well. And I think if we can, I know there's been plenty of other webinars and discussions, but if we can build off the community that have been engaged by this conversation, that's enormously powerful. I really like the work that John shared with us and how that's approaching. And I think the one message I would take away from this, and I was deliberately trying to be a bit provocative about proxies and indicators, etc., is in fact we address these problems by engaging and embracing all aspects of society and how we want to look at these things. So we should be working with the scientists, the academics, the policymakers, the public influencers, as well as the farming community and the NGOs, because it's only in convening those types of coalitions that will actually make the difference in the time frame we have, because time really is of an essence.
Yes. And what do you think the balance should be between, I mean, the issue of nitrogen pesticides has come up, and of course the policymakers can produce sticks and carrots in a combination which will steer the farmers towards more biodiversity management practices. But then you've got the other end of the thing, which is measuring outcomes and rewarding outcomes. Where are you on that? I mean, obviously it's a bit of both, I imagine you will say, but you know, have you got any comments to make on that policy issue?
Well, I think there was a very astute comment in the chat around the amount of food waste, and certainly John will know this, that the nature of food waste is very different in developed nations compared to some of the developing nations in terms of where the waste happens. Behind that question, I think as well, Patrick, is the issue of food security and food poverty, and there was some of that in the chat as well. In fact, if we were able to take the holistic approach and really focus on minimizing waste, you could fundamentally change some of your farming practices so that you could actually address the question you've raised there in a slightly different way. Because you would start to revalue food because you're not wasting so much of it. And therefore you can start looking at how you play with your government subsidies and funds available to the best effect.
Yes, because of course that is the comment of people like, well, not necessarily Jeremy Clarkson, who's just been mentioned in the chat, but farmers who are farming intensively say, well, if we apply all these restrictive measures on practice, we'll only produce half the food. And of course, what you're addressing is a response to that. But Adele, do you want to bring in some other questioners?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you everyone for your questions in the chat. There's been quite a wide-ranging discussion. I want to pick up about organic, actually, because there's been quite a lot of questions about organic. I know we've touched on that a couple of times. But do you all feel that organic is a good enough proxy, if we're using that word, for good biodiversity, or do you think a more nuanced, transparent labeling system is needed to show perhaps, you know, which organic products are more nature friendly, which non-organic products are more nature friendly? Just wondering what
that's a good question for all three of you, perhaps. Marion, do you want to start?
Yes, we analyzed also several organic standards and we discussed with them. And of course, they are much better than standards for conventional agriculture in regard to agricultural practices, but they have a lot of potential for improvement in regard to biodiversity management. Also what we are looking at, the protection and restoration of habitats, the connecting habitats, etc., creating ecological structures. There is a big potential also for organic farmers to improve here.
Sorry, I was muted then. Ian, do you want to comment on this? The labeling of organic as being good enough, you know, as a sort of broad brush thing, or whether we need to extend it outside organic to identify and reward farmers who've got, quote, nature-friendly outcomes?
I think realistically it needs to be extended. I think there's a degree of pragmatism starting from where we are. There's the classic saying that if to get to where we want to go, you wouldn't start from where we are now. The reality is we are where we are. We have to balance many factors and many elements, and not all of them are solely biodiversity. And therefore, I think organic in and of itself is not yet the solution. I think potentially as we progress over the next decade, we need to see more organic, and as we get more organic, we will change both our food valuations, but we'll also change biodiversity. But I don't think it's the sole answer.
Well, That's very interesting. And John Meadly, do you want to speak about this as well?
Yeah, well, I mean, a lot of farmers are effectively organic, but they're not organic. I know, in the uplands, because of the cost, and there's a cost to becoming organic. So we've got, one farmer who is effectively organic, very biodiverse, but he farms with his uncle, and his uncle wants to spot spray thistles, and so they can't be organic. I mean, so it can become quite an artificial thing. But I think there's also something, if I could think of about the organic approach, and that is, at Groundswell, I was promoting these amputee farmers in Sierra Leone. These are farmers who farm on crutches, and they're going permaculture, organic, whatever you call it, agroecological, and they use bokashi, and the bokashi is made from bugs that they harvest from the tropical soils. And part of the ethos behind this is that they do not want farmers to have to borrow money to buy hybrid seeds and fertilizers and get into debt, because the locusts come and everything. And once you you get into debt, you use your land. So going organic, having no external inputs and no credit, and by default, because if you don't have all these chemicals and things coming onto the farm, you actually make it more nature friendly and more biodiverse. That's what they're finding out there.
Yes.
So there's this relationship.
As somebody who's quite heavily involved with the development of the organic standards, and who is now frustrated that the certification scheme that I had a hand in developing does not really measure the impacts of my farming system that I increasingly want to know more about. I for one, feel that the organic certification scheme certainly doesn't yet embrace some of the issues we've been discussing this afternoon in the way that it needs to. But obviously what we need is a system which can be inclusive of all farmers. And I suppose that was one of the things that motivated us right from the start with this sustainable farming framework, that we wanted everyone to be striving to improve on what they did last year. So like a stairway to heaven approach, rather than either you are something or you are not something, which is binary and maybe no longer appropriate in a world where everybody needs to be part of the solution. So Adele, have you got more questions that you distilled out of this incredible chat, which we will share with everyone? We'll record it and share with anyone who wants it.
Yeah, there's been quite a few questions about this balance between having something which is very farmer friendly and potentially more simplistic versus an assessment framework which is complex and would give us a very thorough understanding of the biodiversity on farms. And there's a campaign which I think is really inspirational on climate change called Count Us In, which is basically getting 1 billion people around the world to change one thing in their daily lives to improve climate change, whether it's switching the lights off, using a reusable coffee cup, or driving an electric car, whatever it might be. But the idea is that if everyone around the world just changed one thing, we would make a big difference. So I guess in that context, and maybe to John's point about blood pressure, if we were asking farmers to, let's say in each of the 11 categories of the global farm metric, if we were asking them to start measuring one thing or two things when it comes to biodiversity, what would you all suggest they do?
So I'm going to put that to each of you, and we're getting towards the end of our hour and a half. There are only 12 minutes left if everybody it doesn't already feel like dropping off, when a few people are, but a lot of people have stayed on. So please, would each of you, let's start with you again, Ian. What do you feel about this?
I think it's an engagement activity. My response would be that anything we can do to engage people in finding a solution is good. As a direct question, just responding off the top of my head, I would say to the farming community, which I know they do in really great extent anyway, is focus on soil improvement.
Well, there's something in the chat just come up about that. Because soil, of course, soil biodiversity may be the foundation stone of it all. And therefore indicators of soil biodiversity and what is the unit of measurement for that, and what is the means by which we can determine that, is part of the great challenge of this discussion, isn't it? Identifying realistically measurable indicators. That's what we've got to do, without, you know, going, letting the best be the enemy of the good, etc. And yet without homogenizing the detail and the preciousness of the individual element of the biodiversity.
Yes, and if we're really going to make land sharing work, then effectively we need to make it work for decades ahead. That's what we're talking about. The farming, the requirement for food production is a decadal, multi-generational need. We have to have really healthy soils throughout, because if you get the healthy soils, we've got the healthy plants, and everything follows.
Yes, well, Christopher Stokes there is making the point that it is systemic and that everything's connected, and that really the farming system as a whole is the main contributor to the key biodiversity outcomes. So, now, I think I don't know if you want to comment on that particular point, Marion or John, because then I think once you have, if you want to, we should move to some concluding thoughts and statements.
Mm.
Well, I would just say that you know, when we've been looking at this, we've got your various levels of interest, you know, and eventually you can drill down with the academics, you know, it can go down. But I would agree, the soil health is as you say, healthy soils, plants, animals, etc. And the dung beetles. I was just yesterday talking on this incredible new website, Dung Beetles for Farmers, and you know, being able to recognize not the minutiae, whether they're horned or not, but the different categories of dung beetle. And once people start, you talk to people like John Cherry and Ian Boyd involved, they say they never go anywhere without a spade now, which they'd never done before. And so once people start looking into the soil and monitoring these things, I think I would agree the soil is the starting point.
Yes, and Abby Rose is there pointing out that it is a mindset shift which is behind that, really, our relationship with nature. As has been said, we're not separate from nature, we're part of nature, we are nature, as the Prince of Wales says. So
yeah, big thanks to Abby and Abby Rose for the work in Soil Mental, yeah. and Lisa Norton, who's on this call, I know. Yeah.
So Marion, a quick word, and then let's draw it together.
Also we would invite and motivate farmers to elaborate a biodiversity action plan for the farm, and it is really an individual biodiversity action plan, also to get a good overview on what is on the farm, especially in regard to habitats. And of course, I would also like to see measured soil biodiversity, but also the habitats and some very basic elements of the quality of habitats.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to probably very unfairly summarize from a point of view of a focus group of one who happens to be moderating this event, what I see as the emergent conclusions from this conversation. That, to your point that you've just made, Marion, clearly, let's say you're the Welsh government and you are trying to establish ways by which farmers can be rewarded for increasing their biodiversity. Firstly, you have to somehow establish baseline facts, both farm specific, also your region and landscape and climate specific. And that needs to be partly by gathering information about habitats and all the other points you've just mentioned, and maybe helped by satellites and other landscape scale establishment criteria. But then you need to measure change. And I suppose what we at the Sustainable Food Trust are trying to play our part in contributing is identifying the means by which governments and others, ultimately on the ground undertaken by farmers, can measure the impact of their practices on outcomes, for this seminar specifically on the biodiversity which can coexist with the farming system. Clearly we haven't reached conclusions, but the purpose of this webinar was to establish the need to do this, the need to work collaboratively in emerging with the right indicators and top-down, bottom-up approach and all the things that have been covered. And I certainly feel heartened by this conversation, even though I can see it's immensely complicated and difficult. So may I ask each of you to make a few concluding remarks, whether you're in to find, I know we're not the only coalition of this kind, there are people working on this all over the world, but I think what has now got momentum is this farm metric, the need to harmonize the way in which we collect data. I think that has got real momentum. So if the SFT can play our part in moving towards harmonization, that's what we want to do. So please comment on that, all three of you. Again, would you like to start, Ian?
Yes, I would just fully agree. I think my takeaway or my request is that we are all really good active listeners. This is so fundamental to all aspects of society. It's not just those who own the land, who farm the land, or who enjoy the land. This is population relevant. It's critical to society. If we can do what we've done this afternoon, and we can really actively listen, but also follow up and effectively communicate, that would be a really good outcome.
Well, thank you very much for contributing and also for making this rather dangerous offer that you made on the telephone. We'll follow up with after this, this Zoom. Thank you. So, Marion.
Yeah, I would recommend to involve also, as we did, standard organizations and also in general food companies, especially the standard organizations, are collecting a lot of data, and also data which is very relevant for biodiversity, but they are not afterwards, they are not analyzing this data and not with the view of biodiversity on this. But it would be good, very good to have them as an alliance, and yeah, and then also go parallel. Elaborate, as we did, a system which can be internationally used, but also to go to the ground and use citizen science, for example, and involve citizens and farmers to do the monitoring.
Great, what a great thing to end on, because I've just got this feeling that citizen science should play a role in this, because it's part of the way in which we have to work together to, you know, to ensure that we don't irreversibly destroy our ecosystem. So thank you very much. And John, you're from the ground. The last word.
Closing remark is, I'm very interested in encouraging change. That's the work I've been doing. I mean, even with toilets in rural India, you know, you need a magnet. People need to be attracted to things, and that attraction, it can be monetary, but it can also be fulfillment. It can also be joy. And I was talking to a farmer the other day, and he's one of our, he's now certified Pasture for Life. And he said, John, it's amazing. He said, I was the ultra conventional farm, and now he says, you can't stop me. I'm looking everywhere. I'm looking into my soil. I'm seeing all of this this happening. So we need that magnet, and to attract people to do it. And that's what I've learned over the last 4 years working with farmers, and you know, anything I can do to help, happy to do so.
Well,
thank you for organising this and giving me the chance to share what we've learned on the journey.
Well, thank you, John, and also just huge thanks to all the participants in this and for the amazing contributions in the chat. We will do everything possible to not only share the outcomes, the key outcomes of this discussion, which we've not only been recording but taking notes from, but also find a way of building this loose-knit coalition which will hopefully, with other coalitions, work towards this harmonization process without losing the essential difference of every farm in the world in the process of, you know, bringing it all together. Adele, any final remarks from you?
No, just to echo all that you've said, Patrick, and thank the speakers for joining us on a Friday afternoon. That's very noble of you all. So I hope
very noble,
yeah.
Especially for an hour and a half. Thank you, and all of you. Thank you. Let's move this thing forward. because I think everyone on this webinar is passionate about this issue, and rightly so. So bless you all, and thank you, and have a great weekend.